The auction paddle went up before Daniel Cross could talk himself out of it. His last $410 committed to a foreclosed ironworks that nobody else wanted because sometimes desperation looked like courage from the outside. The auctioneer's gavel fell with finality that made Daniel's stomach tighten, and his 7-year-old son Leo squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt, both of them knowing they'd just bet everything on a gutted industrial building in western Pennsylvania that hadn't forged steel in 30 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel had $300 left in his bank account after the purchase, a 1997 Ford truck with 200,000 miles, and a notice that their current apartment required 60 days to vacate for renovation. The ironworks was the cheapest property at the county foreclosure auction, passed over by investors and developers who saw only liability in a building that would cost hundreds of thousands to demolish or millions to restore. But Daniel saw something different. He saw a roof over their heads and space where Leo could play without neighbors complaining, saw possibility born from the fact that they had nowhere else to go. They drove to the property that afternoon, following county roads that wound through hills where steel towns had once thrived before economic forces moved production overseas and left communities to figure out what came after industry died. The ironworks sat at the edge of Milford, a town that had shrunk from 15,000 residents to 4,500 over 50 years, its main street half empty, its schools consolidated, its young people gone to places with futures that didn't require mining family history for meaning. The building emerged through trees like something from another era, a massive structure of brick and steel, 3 stories tall and easily the length of a football field, its windows broken or missing, its roof sagging in places where weather had found weakness. Rust covered everything metal, weeds grew through cracks in the concrete yard, and graffiti marked the walls where kids had found temporary entertainment in defacing what adults had abandoned. Leo pressed against the truck's window, his small face showing the mixture of fear and fascination that children bring to places that look haunted. "Is this where we're going to live?" "It's where we're going to figure things out," Daniel said, which was the most honest answer he could give a 7-year-old who'd already learned that life didn't follow the scripts other kids seemed to receive. Leo's mother had left 2 years ago, a note saying she couldn't handle being a parent, that she needed to find herself somewhere that didn't include obligations she hadn't asked for. Daniel had raised Leo alone since, working construction when he could find it, watching their savings disappear into rent and childcare and the 1,000 small expenses that accumulated when you were barely surviving. Then the construction company had closed, its owner declaring bankruptcy and leaving 15 employees with unpaid final paychecks and no recourse. Daniel had spent 3 months looking for work, burning through savings and then borrowing from his brother who'd made it clear the help came with judgment about choices and priorities. The apartment eviction notice had arrived on the same day he'd seen the auction advertisement, and desperation had transformed a ridiculous idea into a plan he was now committed to executing. They walked the property's perimeter, Daniel assessing what he'd actually bought beyond the vague description in the auction listing. The ironworks had been built in 1889 by the Carver family, had operated continuously through 2 world wars in the Depression, had employed 300 men at its peak producing steel components for bridges and buildings and machinery. It had closed in 1994 when the last Carver descendant sold to a holding company that had stripped equipment and left the building to decay. The main forge building was structurally sound despite its appearance, the brick walls solid, the steel frame intact. The roof needed work but was reparable. The interior was gutted, everything valuable removed years ago, leaving only the bones of what had been an impressive operation. But bones were enough. The building had plumbing connections, electrical infrastructure, and most importantly, it was as free and clear once he paid the $410. The office building attached to the forge was in better condition, its roof intact, its windows mostly unbroken. Daniel forced open a side door, its lock corroded past functioning, and entered spaces that held the ghost of industrial prosperity. The main office still had furniture scattered around, desks and filing cabinets left behind when they weren't worth moving. Papers covered the floor, decades of records that had been rifled through by salvagers and vandals, leaving only what held no value to anyone. Leo stayed close as they explored, his small hand finding Daniel's whenever shadows seemed too deep or sounds suggested they weren't alone. The building made noises, wind through broken windows, animals nesting in walls, the settling of materials stressed by decades of weather. It felt haunted not by ghosts but by memory, by the accumulation of workers who'd spent careers here, by the weight of industry that had sustained families and communities before becoming obsolete. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They found the superintendent's office on the second floor, a corner room with windows overlooking the forge floor. Someone had left behind a portrait, a stern man in his 50s wearing clothes from the 1940s, identified by a tarnished plaque as Harrison Carver, Ironworks Superintendent 1932 to 1976. The man in the portrait looked like someone who'd known hard work in harder times, whose life had been measured through tonnage produced and standards met. Daniel stood looking at the portrait, feeling the weight of buying a building that represented someone else's legacy, someone else's life work that had ended in abandonment and foreclosure. He wondered if Harrison Carver had known the ironworks would close, had seen the economic forces that would make his expertise obsolete, had died believing his life's work mattered or knowing it would be forgotten. "Dad, there's a door here," Leo said, pulling at Daniel's sleeve. He pointed to what looked like wood paneling behind a filing cabinet that had been pushed aside, probably by salvagers looking for anything valuable. Daniel moved the cabinet completely, revealing not paneling but a door painted to match the walls, its handle removed, its existence disguised by years of neglect and the assumption that anything worth finding had already been found. The door was locked, but the frame was weakened by moisture damage. Daniel forced it open with his shoulder, the wood splintering around the ancient lock, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. He used his phone's flashlight to illuminate concrete steps leading down, the air rising from below cool and stale, untouched for decades. "Stay here," Daniel told Leo, but his son shook his head with the stubbornness that was both frustrating and reassuring. Leo had learned not to be left alone, had developed an attachment that came from losing one parent and fearing he'd lose the other through accident or inattention. They descended together, Daniel going first, testing each step before letting Leo follow. The staircase went down 20 feet, far deeper than a normal basement, ending at another door that was steel rather than wood, its lock newer and more substantial. This door had been opened recently, the dust on its handle was disturbed, and boot prints in the accumulated grime showed someone had been here within the past months rather than decades. Daniel's construction experience told him this wasn't original to the building. Someone had added this door, had secured whatever lay beyond with locks that suggested value rather than simple storage. He tried forcing it, but the steel held, the lock professional quality rather than the kind of hardware that failed through age and rust. They returned upstairs, Daniel's mind working through implications. The ironworks had been foreclosed 2 years ago according to the auction documents, had sat empty since then. But someone had been in the hidden basement recently, had maintained locks that kept casual explorers from discovering whatever was worth protecting. He found a crowbar in his truck, returned to the basement with Leo trailing behind, and worked the door's hinges rather than its lock. The hinges were old, the screws corroded, and after 20 minutes of effort the entire door came free, revealing a corridor that extended into darkness beyond his phone's light range. The corridor was concrete, modern construction that didn't match the building's 1889 origins. Someone had excavated this space decades after the ironworks was built, had created a passage that led somewhere the original builders hadn't intended. Daniel followed it 50 feet before reaching another door, this one standing open, its lock broken, its heavy steel pushed aside by whoever had been here before him. Beyond was a room maybe 20 feet square, concrete walls and ceiling, lit by emergency lighting that still functioned on battery backup. And in the center of the room, set into the floor like a monument, was a vault door easily 6 feet in diameter, its steel polished despite decades underground, its combination lock complex enough to suggest serious security. Daniel stood looking at the vault, Leo pressed against his leg, both of them understanding they'd found something that explained why an ironworks nobody wanted had been foreclosed and left to decay while someone maintained access to its hidden depths. The vault was modern, installed sometime in the past 50 years, built by people who had resources and reasons to hide things where nobody would look. His phone rang, the sound jarring in the underground silence. "Unknown number," but Daniel answered because contractors lived or died by being available. "Mr. Cross?" A woman's voice, professional and direct. "My name is Catherine Mills. I represent the Carver Family Trust, and I need to speak with you urgently about the property you purchased today. We were unaware the ironworks was being auctioned until after the sale completed, and we need to discuss purchasing it back from you at a substantial profit. How did you get my number? The auction is public record. Mr. Cross, the ironworks contains materials and records that belong to the Carver family, that were supposed to be removed before foreclosure. We're prepared to offer you $10,000 for immediate resale, a significant return on your $410 investment." Daniel looked at the vault, at Leo watching him with trust that demanded he make smart choices, at the underground room that someone wanted badly enough to make offers within hours of purchase. "I'm not interested in selling. We need the building." Catherine's tone changed, friendliness evaporating into something harder. "Mr. Cross, you don't understand what you've purchased or who you're dealing with. The ironworks has complications you're not equipped to handle, and refusing our offer creates problems for everyone involved." "Then I guess everyone has problems," Daniel said, and ended the call. Leo looked up at him with the seriousness children develop when they've learned to read adult stress. "Was that a bad person?" "I don't know yet," Daniel said honestly. "But we're going to figure out what this vault is, why people want this building so badly, and whether buying it was the smartest thing we've ever done or the biggest mistake we could make." They climbed back upstairs, Daniel already planning how to open a vault he couldn't afford to crack professionally, thinking about Catherine Mills's call and the implications of offers made within hours of purchase, wondering what Harrison Carver or his descendants had hidden in a concrete room beneath an ironworks that had been designed to forge steel but had ended up concealing secrets worth protecting decades after the forges went cold. The building settled around them as evening approached, its vast spaces filled with shadows and history and the weight of choices that would determine whether Daniel's desperate gamble provided sanctuary or invited complications they couldn't survive. Leo held his hand as they walked back to the truck, both of them looking at the ironworks that was now their responsibility, their shelter, their inheritance from strangers who'd left mysteries buried beneath industrial ruins. Daniel had bought the building thinking he was getting refuge from homelessness, but the vault and Catherine Mills's immediate call suggested he'd actually purchased entry into something far more complicated, secrets that wealthy families protected, underground rooms that shouldn't exist, and forces that would pressure him the same way they'd pressured whoever had owned this property before foreclosure made it available to desperate men with $410 and nowhere else to turn. The sun set behind the ironworks, painting its brick walls in shades that made the building look almost beautiful, almost like something worth fighting for rather than something abandoned and forgotten. And Daniel stood beside his truck with Leo, both of them facing a future that had just become infinitely more complicated but also possibly, maybe, if they were lucky and brave and stubborn enough to stand their ground, more secure than anything they'd had when the day started with an auction paddle going up and a gavel falling like thunder. Daniel spent the first night in the ironworks office building with Leo curled against him in a sleeping bag, both of them listening to sounds that magnified in darkness, wind through broken windows, animals moving through walls, the settling of a structure that had held steel and heat and human labor for a century before being left to remember what it had been. He didn't sleep much, his mind circling the vault and Catherine Mills's call and the fact that someone had maintained access to underground rooms while letting the rest of the building decay. Morning came cold and gray, November weather that promised winter was coming whether they were ready or not. Daniel fed Leo cereal with milk from a cooler, both of them eating in the superintendent's office where Harrison Carver's portrait watched with an expression that suggested he'd seen harder mornings and survived them. The building looked worse in daylight, more broken, more impossible, more like a mistake than a solution. But the vault pulled at Daniel's thoughts the way unsolved problems did, demanding attention even when attention seemed like the last thing he could afford. He'd spent years in construction learning to read buildings, to understand what walls concealed and what foundations bore. The underground vault wasn't original to the ironworks, wasn't built by people who forged steel for bridges. Someone had excavated that space decades later, had installed security that suggested protecting something worth more than equipment or records. He left Leo drawing in the office and returned to the basement alone, descending the hidden stairs with a better flashlight and the crowbar that had opened the steel door. The vault sat in its concrete room, 6 feet of polished steel set into the floor, its combination lock showing 8 digits rather than the standard 3. Professional security, the kind banks used for safety deposit boxes or museums installed for high-value collections. Daniel examined the vault's edges, looking for weaknesses that construction experience might reveal. The installation was expert, the concrete poured around the vault's housing, no gaps that would allow leverage. Opening it without the combination would require cutting equipment he couldn't afford and expertise he didn't have. He was staring at wealth or evidence or something valuable enough to hide but with no way to access it. His phone rang again, Catherine Mills's number showing on the screen. He let it go to voicemail, but she called back immediately, persistence that suggested urgency beyond simple property recovery. "Mr. Cross, ignoring me won't make this situation simpler." Her voice carried frustration wrapped in professional courtesy. "The Carver family has legal counsel prepared to challenge your purchase, to demonstrate that critical information about the property was withheld from the auction listing. We can make owning that building very expensive for you." "You're welcome to try," Daniel said, keeping his voice neutral. "But I bought the property legally at a public auction. What you hid in it isn't my problem." "What we hid?" Catherine's tone sharpened. "Mr. Cross, the vault you found was installed by my client's grandfather in 1976, contains family documents and memorabilia that should have been removed before foreclosure. We're offering to purchase the entire property for $25,000, well above market value for a derelict industrial building. That's generous compensation for 1 day of ownership. $25,000 would change everything, would provide security, would let him find proper housing for Leo, would eliminate the desperate gamble he'd made buying a building he couldn't afford to maintain." But Catherine's escalating offers within 24 hours suggested the vault held something worth far more than family memorabilia. "I need time to think about it," Daniel said, buying space to understand what he'd actually found. After Catherine hung up, Daniel called his brother Eric, the one who'd loaned him money with judgment attached. Eric was a lawyer in Pittsburgh, successful enough to live in suburbs where ironworks were history rather than present reality, removed enough from Daniel's struggles that advice came with condescension. "You bought a what?" Eric's voice carried the disbelief Daniel had expected. "For $400? Daniel, that's not solving your housing problem, that's creating a liability you can't afford. Someone's offering $25,000 to buy it back. Same day I purchased it." Eric was quiet for a moment, lawyer instincts processing implications. "That suggests you found something valuable, which means you need proper legal counsel before you do anything. Don't talk to whoever's calling you, don't agree to anything, and definitely don't try opening whatever you found without understanding the legal ramifications." "I can't afford proper legal counsel. I know someone who might help pro bono if there's actually something valuable involved. Send me everything, the auction documents, the property records, photos of what you found. I'll see what I can figure out." After Daniel hung up, he photographed the vault, the underground room, the hidden staircase. He was uploading them to Eric when he heard Leo calling from upstairs, his voice carrying the edge of fear that made Daniel move fast. He found Leo in the office with a man who'd entered without knocking, who wore expensive casual clothes and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. Late 50s, fit, with the kind of grooming that required money and attention. He smiled when Daniel appeared, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cross, I apologize for the intrusion. I'm Preston Carver. My grandfather built this ironworks." He gestured around the office. "I grew up visiting this building, learning the business my family ran for 3 generations. I was hoping we could talk about your purchase and come to an arrangement that benefits everyone." Daniel moved between Preston and Leo, his body language making clear the territorial claim fathers make when strangers approach their children. "Your lawyer already called. Twice. Catherine can be aggressive. I prefer direct conversation." Preston walked to the window overlooking the forge floor, his expression showing something that might have been nostalgia or might have been calculation. My grandfather Harrison ran this ironworks for 44 years, saw it through the Depression and 2 wars. He was a hard man but honest, built a reputation for quality that made Carver's steel known across 3 states. Then why did it close? Economics. Foreign steel became cheaper, customers moved production overseas, and my father refused to adapt. He ran the business into the ground rather than modernize, and by the time I was old enough to take over, there was nothing left to save. Preston turned from a window. But my grandfather knew the end was coming. In his final years, he prepared for it, converted assets, protected what mattered, ensured the family would survive even if the business didn't. By installing a vault in the basement. Preston's expression confirmed what Daniel had guessed. Among other preparations, yes. The vault contains materials my grandfather wanted protected, that were supposed to be removed before the property went to foreclosure. The bank's incompetence put us in this position, but I'm prepared to compensate you fairly for the inconvenience. What's in the vault? Family documents, stock certificates, bonds, financial instruments from when my grandfather liquidated business assets in the 70s. Nothing that concerns you, but everything that belongs to the Carver estate. Preston pulled out a checkbook. I'll write you a check for $30,000 right now. You sign a quitclaim deed, we handle the transfer paperwork, and you walk away with enough money to start over somewhere more suitable for raising a child. The offer was tempting in ways that made Daniel's chest tight. $30,000 was more money than he'd seen at once in his life, was security he desperately needed, was the smart choice that would let him provide for Leo without gambling on derelict buildings and hidden vaults. But Preston's immediate appearance after Catherine's calls, the escalating offers, the way both of them emphasized family documents rather than discussing actual value, all of it suggested Daniel had stumbled into something worth far more than $30,000. I need to think about it, Daniel said again. Preston's friendly demeanor cooled. Mr. Cross, I'm trying to resolve this amicably. But I have resources and legal standing to make your ownership very complicated. The vault was installed without proper permits, which means you're in possession of unpermitted excavation that violates building codes. The environmental assessment that should have been done before auction would have flagged contamination from decades of steel production. I can bury you in legal challenges that cost more money than you have to defend. Then I guess you'll have to do that, because I'm not selling today. After Preston left, Leo asked the question Daniel had been asking himself. Why didn't you take the money, Dad? We need it. Because people don't offer $30,000 for family documents, Daniel said. And because your mom taught me that when people pressure you to make fast decisions, it usually means the decision benefits them more than you. The mention of Leo's mother created a moment of shared grief. She'd left, but her lessons remained, shaped both of them in ways that abandonment paradoxically made stronger. Leo nodded with understanding beyond his years, had learned to trust his father's judgment because he'd watched Daniel make hard choices that protected them both. That afternoon, Eric called back with information that transformed Daniel's understanding of what he'd bought. The ironworks went into foreclosure because the holding company that owned it defaulted on environmental remediation bonds. They'd been using the property for waste storage, got caught violating EPA regulations, and walked away rather than pay cleanup costs. The bank foreclosed but discovered that proper environmental assessment would cost more than the property was worth, so they auctioned it as is with disclosures buried in fine print nobody read. So I bought a contaminated industrial site. Potentially, yes. But here's where it gets interesting. I found records showing the Carver family contested the foreclosure, claimed they still had materials on site that belonged to the family trust. The bank rejected their claims, said the family had 2 years to remove personal property and had failed to do so. The Carvers sued, but the case was dismissed because they couldn't specify what they'd left behind without admitting they'd maintained unauthorized access to foreclosed property. Daniel processed this, pieces fitting together. So they've been trying to get the vault's contents for 2 years but couldn't legally claim it without admitting they'd been trespassing. Exactly. And now you own the property legally, which means whatever's in that vault belongs to you as contents transferred with the real estate sale. The Carvers know it, which is why they're offering money rather than just demanding you return their property. What do you think is actually in there? Eric hesitated. Based on the offers you're getting in the family's desperation? My guess is cash or bearer bonds, something valuable and portable that Harrison Carver converted from business assets before the ironworks closed. If he was smart and saw the end coming, he might have liquidated everything and hidden it where his son couldn't waste it. How much are we talking about? No way to know without opening it. But if they're offering $30,000 sight unseen, the actual value is probably 10 times that minimum. Maybe more. Eric paused. Daniel, this is beyond my expertise. If you actually have something valuable, you need specialists, lawyers who handle estate recovery, accountants who can assess financial instruments, probably law enforcement to document everything before you open it. Why law enforcement? Because if there's serious money in that vault, the Carvers might claim it was stolen, might argue their grandfather was hiding assets from creditors or tax authorities. You need documentation showing you discovered it legally as part of your property purchase, that you reported it properly, that everything you do follows the rules exactly. After talking with Eric, Daniel stood in the superintendent's office looking at Harrison Carver's portrait, trying to understand the man who'd built a successful business and then hidden its liquidated assets in a vault his own son couldn't access. The portrait showed someone hard and proud, someone who'd survived the Depression by being tougher than circumstances required, who'd built something that employed hundreds and sustained a community. But Harrison had also been someone who didn't trust his son to preserve what he'd built, who'd chosen to hide wealth rather than pass it forward openly. That spoke to family dysfunction that had played out over decades, that had resulted in a vault installed secretly and access controlled so tightly that foreclosure had locked everyone out. Margaret Chen arrived at the ironworks around 5, an elderly woman who introduced herself as Harrison Carver's former secretary, who'd worked at the ironworks for 30 years before it closed. She'd heard through the town's gossip network that someone had finally bought the building, wanted to see it one more time before she was too old to make the trip. Daniel made coffee on a camp stove and listened while Margaret talked about working for Harrison, about the ironworks' final decades when foreign competition slowly killed domestic steel production, about watching a proud business decline into irrelevance. Harrison knew it was ending, Margaret said, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup for warmth. In 1976, he started liquidating assets quietly, converting everything to cash and bonds that his son Robert couldn't gamble away. Robert was a drinker, made bad investments, would have destroyed the family fortune in 5 years if Harrison hadn't protected it. By hiding it in a vault. Margaret nodded. Harrison told me he was building insurance for his grandchildren, that Robert would waste everything but Preston and his sister might someday need what their grandfather had saved. He made me promise not to tell Robert where the money was, said it would come out when the time was right. Did it ever come out? Harrison died in 1978 before he could tell Preston the combination. He'd written it down somewhere, but nobody ever found it. The vault sat there for years, everyone knowing Harrison had hidden the family fortune but nobody able to access it. Margaret looked around the office. When Robert finally sold to the holding company in 2006, Preston tried to maintain access to the vault, but the new owners caught him trespassing and banned the family from the property. Then came foreclosure, and the Carvers have been trying to reclaim it ever since. Why are you telling me this? Because Harrison Carver was a hard man but a fair one, and what he built shouldn't go to his grandson who's spent 40 years trying to reclaim money he never earned. Preston is his father's son, entitled, aggressive, thinks family name entitles him to things he hasn't worked for. Margaret met Daniel's eyes. If you found that vault, it's yours legally. Don't let Preston pressure you into surrendering what desperate times led you to. After Margaret left, Daniel sat with Leo in the darkening office, both of them quiet. The ironworks settled around them with its evening sounds, and somewhere below them the vault waited with its secrets that had outlasted the man who'd installed it, that had become the object of family feuds and legal battles and now Daniel's unexpected inheritance. His phone buzzed with a text from Preston Carver, final offer $50,000 cash tomorrow if you sign tonight. After that, I pursue legal remedies that will cost you everything. Daniel showed the message to Leo, watching his son read it with the seriousness children develop when they're included in adult decisions. That's a lot of money, Leo said quietly. It is. But you're not going to take it. Why do you say that? Leo looked up at him with eyes that held trust. Daniel had spent 2 years earning through consistent choices that put Leo's well-being above comfort or convenience. Because you told me that when people try to scare you into choosing fast, it means they're scared too. And scared people don't offer $50,000 unless what they're scared of losing is worth way more. Daniel pulled Leo close, feeling his son's small frame against him, feeling the weight of choices that would teach Leo what standing for things actually meant. Preston Carver had resources and lawyers and family connections that could make defending the property expensive and difficult. But he was also desperate enough to escalate offers from $10,000 to $50,000 within 24 hours, which suggested the vault held something worth fighting for even when fighting seemed impossible. "We're going to need help," Daniel said. "Real lawyers, proper documentation, maybe law enforcement to witness what we find. Because if we're doing this, we're doing it right, not sneaking around or hiding things, but following every rule exactly so nobody can claim we stole what we legally own." That night, while Leo slept in the office wrapped in a sleeping bag, Daniel called the FBI field office in Pittsburgh. He explained that he'd purchased foreclosed property, had found a vault installed without permits, had been offered escalating amounts of money by the previous owner's family, needed guidance on proper procedures for documenting and securing whatever he found. The agent who took his call was skeptical at first, probably assuming this was another false alarm or conspiracy theory. But when Daniel mentioned the Carver name and described the vault's professional installation and the family's aggressive response, the skepticism shifted into interest. "Don't open anything," the agent said. "Don't let anyone pressure you into signing documents or accepting payment. We'll send someone tomorrow to assess the situation and determine if there's federal jurisdiction." After hanging up, Daniel stood at the window overlooking the forge floor where 300 men had once worked, where Harrison Carver had run operations for 44 years, where steel had been shaped into components that built bridges and buildings across 3 states. The building was dark now, cold and empty, its purpose stolen by economic forces that had moved production overseas and left communities to figure out what came after industry died. But underneath the abandoned forge, Harrison Carver had built one final protection, a vault that outlasted his business and his son and the family dysfunction that had prevented its wealth from being claimed. That vault now belonged to Daniel through desperate purchase and legal transfer, represented either security or complication depending on whether he had the courage to stand against people with resources and patience and generational commitment to reclaiming what they believed was theirs. The ironworks breathed around him in the darkness, its vast spaces holding history and secrets and the accumulated weight of choices that had led 3 generations of carvers to this moment, Preston desperately trying to reclaim his grandfather's hidden fortune, Daniel desperately trying to provide security for Leo, both of them fighting over a vault that neither had opened but that both knew held answers that would determine what happened next. Daniel had made his choice by calling the FBI. Had committed to doing this properly even if properly was slower and more complicated than simply accepting Preston's money and walking away. Tomorrow would bring federal agents and documentation and the beginning of whatever process turned a hidden vault into either vindication or disaster. The building settled into night, and Daniel sat beside Leo watching his son sleep, thinking about Margaret's words about Harrison Carver being fair if hard, about Preston being entitled and aggressive, about desperate times leading to discoveries that changed everything. He'd bought the ironworks thinking he was getting shelter, but the vault had transformed his purchase into something far more significant, a battle over inheritance and legitimacy and whether desperate men who followed rules deserved what they found more than wealthy families who'd lost control of fortunes their grandfathers had hidden from them. Morning would come whether Daniel was ready or not, would bring FBI agents and Preston's threatened legal remedies and the slow machinery of proper procedure turning Daniel's discovery into either the greatest gamble he'd ever won or the mistake that would prove his brother right about choices and consequences. But for now, in the darkness of an abandoned ironworks with his son sleeping beside him, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years of scraping by, the possibility that standing for principles might actually matter, that doing things right might be rewarded, that desperate gambles sometimes led to places that honored both the desperation and the courage it took to try. The FBI agents arrived at 9 the next morning, 2 of them in an unmarked sedan, carrying themselves with the careful neutrality of people trained to assess situations before committing to positions. Special Agent Lisa Chen was mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with the directness of someone who'd heard every story and believed none until proven. Her partner, Agent Marcus Wright, was younger, took photographs and documented everything while Chen asked questions that revealed she'd already researched the property and the Carver family before arriving. Daniel walked them through the building, showed them the hidden staircase, the underground corridor, the vault sitting in its concrete room like something from a heist movie. Chen examined the installation carefully, noting the professional quality, the lack of permits, the fact that someone had maintained access for decades while the building above decayed. This wasn't built by the original ironworks owners, Chen observed. The concrete work dates to the 70s based on materials and technique. Someone excavated under an operating industrial building and installed a bank-grade vault without anyone knowing, or at least without anyone documenting it officially. Harrison Carver, Daniel said. The ironworks superintendent. He installed it in 1976 according to his former secretary. To hide what? Assets he liquidated from the business. His son was unreliable, and Harrison wanted to protect the family fortune for his grandchildren. Chen photographed the vault from multiple angles, documented its specifications, the room's dimensions, the hidden access route. And the current generation has been trying to reclaim it since foreclosure. They've offered me $50,000 to quit claim the property back to them. Without ever specifying what's in the vault. Which suggests they know it contains something worth substantially more than $50,000. Chen stood, her expression showing the calculation of someone deciding whether federal resources should be invested in what might be a simple property dispute. Mr. Cross, opening this vault could reveal anything from worthless papers to evidence of crimes to actual valuable assets. Before we proceed, I need to understand your position. Are you claiming ownership of the vault's contents, or are you asking us to mediate between you and the Carver family? Daniel had thought about this through a sleepless night, had weighed options and consequences and the lessons he wanted to teach Leo about how you claim things that became yours through accident rather than intention. I'm claiming ownership as contents transferred with the real estate purchase. But I want everything documented properly, want witnesses to what we find, want to follow every legal requirement exactly so nobody can claim I stole anything or hid evidence. That's smart. Chen pulled out her phone. I'm calling our asset forfeiture team and a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office. If there's significant value here, we need proper chain of custody from the moment it's opened. The process took 3 days to organize. Federal prosecutors wanted time to research the Carver family's business history, to determine if the vault might contain evidence of tax evasion or money laundering, to establish jurisdiction before committing resources. Preston Carver's lawyers filed an emergency injunction trying to prevent the vault's opening, claiming family ownership of contents regardless of property transfer. The injunction was denied, but it bought time for more legal maneuvering. Daniel spent those 3 days in the ironworks with Leo, both of them existing in strange limbo, owners of a building they couldn't afford to maintain, possessors of a vault they couldn't open without federal assistance, targets of legal pressure from people with resources they couldn't match. Eric sent a lawyer from Pittsburgh, a woman named Sarah Martinez who specialized in property disputes and who took Daniel's case pro bono after Eric explained the situation. The Carvers are going to argue that Harrison's liquidated assets belong to the business, that hiding them was fraudulent conveyance to avoid creditors, Sarah explained during their first meeting. They'll claim you can't own what was essentially stolen money, that it should revert to the Carver estate or the business's creditors. Can they win that argument? Depends what we find and how old it is. If Harrison liquidated business assets in 1976 and hid them, any creditors from that era would have claims that expired decades ago. If he was hiding personal wealth, it belongs to his estate, which means his heirs, Preston and his sister. But if he specifically structured things to transfer with the property, if he left documentation showing intent, you might have legitimate claim as the current property owner. The vault opening happened on a gray November morning, federal agents and prosecutors present, a professional safe technician brought in to handle the 8-digit combination lock that had defeated 2 generations of Carvers. Daniel and Leo watched from the corridor while the technician worked, the process taking 2 hours of careful manipulation before the mechanism finally released. The vault door swung open on hinges that still moved smoothly despite decades sealed, revealing a space maybe 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide. And inside, organized with the precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing industrial operations, was Harrison Carver's final legacy. Cash filled the bottom half, bundles of currency in denominations that ranged from 50s to hundreds, organized by year and amount, wrapped in plastic that had protected them from moisture and time. Agent Chen photographed everything before touching it, documented the arrangements, noted that the newest bills dated to 1977, the year before Harrison died. Above the cash were filing boxes containing bearer bonds from the 1970s, stock certificates for companies that had either survived or been absorbed by larger corporations, and real estate deeds for properties across Pennsylvania that Harrison had apparently purchased and hidden from his son. More boxes held gold coins in mint condition, silver bars, and jewelry that looked like family heirlooms Harrison had protected from Robert's likely attempts to liquidate them. And on top of everything, in a waterproof case, was a letter addressed simply to whoever finds this with honest need. Agent Chen read it aloud, her voice carrying through the underground room. I am Harrison Carver, superintendent of Carver Steel Ironworks, and I write this in 1977 knowing my time is short and my life's work is ending. The ironworks will close within my lifetime, foreign steel has made our operation obsolete, and my son Robert lacks the skill or discipline to adapt to changing markets. I have spent 44 years building this business from what my father left me into something that employed 300 men and supported a community. But I have also watched my son waste every opportunity given him, squander every advantage, demonstrate through consistent failure that he will destroy in 5 years what took 2 generations to build. So I have done what hard times require. I liquidated business assets systematically over the past year, converted everything to cash and portable wealth, hidden it where Robert cannot waste it and where it might survive to serve better purposes than funding his drinking and gambling. If you are reading this, the ironworks has failed as I knew it would, and this vault has survived foreclosure and abandonment to be discovered by someone desperate enough or lucky enough to find what I hid. The contents represent $1.8 million in 1977 value, the accumulated profit from 4 decades of honest work, now yours by right of discovery and property ownership. I ask only that you use it more wisely than my son would have, that you build something rather than simply consume, that you remember this wealth came from men who worked steel and earned every dollar through sweat and skill. Don't waste it. Don't squander it. Build something that matters. Harrison Carver, March 15, 1977. The room was silent after Chen finished reading, everyone processing what Harrison's letter meant. The vault didn't contain stolen money or hidden assets, it contained a grandfather's desperate attempt to protect 44 years of work from a son who would have destroyed it, a final gift to whoever was desperate enough to need it and honest enough to claim it properly. The counting and authentication took 2 weeks. Federal agents documented everything, the U.S. Attorney's Office researched the bearer bonds and stock certificates, asset specialists assessed current values of investments Harrison had made 50 years ago. The cash alone totaled $1.2 million in 1977 currency, still legal tender, worth exactly what it had been worth when Harrison wrapped it in plastic and sealed it underground. But the bonds and stocks had appreciated dramatically. Companies Harrison had invested in had grown or been acquired, their shares worth multiples of their 1977 values. The real estate deeds were for properties that had increased substantially as Pennsylvania land values rose. The gold and silver had appreciated with commodity markets. When the final assessment came back, Agent Chen delivered it to Daniel in the ironworks office where Harrison's portrait still hung. Total current value is approximately $8.7 million. That's cash, bonds at current redemption value, stocks at today's market prices, real estate at assessed value, and precious metals at spot prices. Daniel sat down heavily, Leo pressed against his side, both of them trying to process numbers that seemed impossible. $8.7 million. More money than Daniel could properly conceptualize, more than 3 generations of construction workers could earn, more than he'd ever imagined possessing. There's a complication, Chen continued. Preston Carver is claiming the assets belong to his grandfather's estate, that they should pass through inheritance laws rather than property transfer. He's filed suit asserting his rights as Harrison's heir regardless of where the assets were stored. Can he win? It's complicated. Harrison's letter suggests intent to transfer the assets with the property, but it's not a formal will or trust document. The fact that he hid the assets from his son suggests he didn't want them going through normal inheritance channels. But Preston has legitimate claim as Harrison's grandchild, and the law generally favors heirs in estate disputes. Sarah Martinez had different analysis when Daniel called her. Harrison's letter creates an interesting situation. He essentially made a conditional gift. Whoever finds this with honest need receives the contents. You found it, you clearly have honest need, and you followed proper procedures in documenting the discovery. That strengthens your position considerably. But Preston is Harrison's actual heir. Preston is the heir Harrison explicitly tried to prevent from receiving this money. The letter makes clear Harrison didn't trust his son to preserve the wealth, and by extension didn't trust Preston to use it wisely. That intent matters, even if the letter isn't a formal legal document. The legal battle consumed the next 8 months. Preston's lawyers filed claims arguing that Harrison couldn't legally disinherit his heirs through hidden assets, that the vault's contents belonged to his estate regardless of where they were stored. Daniel's lawyers countered that Harrison had explicitly structured the vault to transfer with the property, that his letter demonstrated intent to gift the contents to whoever purchased the foreclosed ironworks. The case attracted media attention. Small-town man discovers hidden fortune, wealthy family fights to reclaim it, legal question of whether you could structure inheritance through property transfer rather than formal estate planning. Reporters camped outside the ironworks, wrote articles about Harrison Carver's life and Robert's failures and Preston's decades-long pursuit of his grandfather's hidden wealth. Through it all, Daniel and Leo lived in the ironworks office building, existing on Daniel's remaining savings and the construction work he found in nearby towns. They couldn't access the vault's contents while litigation was pending, couldn't benefit from the discovery that had transformed their situation from desperate to potentially secure. But they also couldn't be evicted, couldn't be pressured into surrender, had the strange comfort of knowing that resolution would eventually come even if waiting was its own kind of hardship. Margaret Chin visited regularly during those months, bringing food and company and stories about Harrison that helped Daniel understand the man whose final gift had created such complications. Harrison had been hard but fair, demanding but consistent, had built the ironworks into something that mattered through discipline his son had never learned. Harrison knew Robert would waste everything, Margaret said during one visit. He watched his son drink away opportunities, make bad investments, blame everyone else for failures that were purely his own choices. Installing that vault was Harrison's way of protecting what he'd built from the son who would destroy it. But it meant Preston couldn't inherit either. Harrison died before Preston was old enough to prove whether he was more like his father or his grandfather. I think Harrison hoped Preston might be different, might someday find the vault and use it wisely. But he structured it so that if the family lost the property, if Preston proved as unreliable as Robert, the money would go to someone who actually needed it. The legal resolution came finally through settlement rather than judgment. Preston's lawyers acknowledged that Harrison's letter demonstrated clear intent to transfer the assets with the property, that fighting further would cost more in legal fees than Preston stood to gain. They negotiated a division. Daniel received $6.2 million in cash, bonds, stocks, and precious metals. Preston received the real estate deeds to properties Harrison had purchased. Both sides agreed to withdraw claims and sign releases preventing further litigation. It wasn't the full $8.7 million Daniel had technically discovered, but it was life-changing wealth that transformed every calculation about security and future and what he could build for Leo. More importantly, it came through proper legal process rather than surrender or theft, came with documentation showing he'd followed every rule and reported everything honestly. On a cool spring morning, 9 months after buying the ironworks for $410, Daniel stood in the office where Harrison's portrait still hung and signed final settlement documents with Sarah Martinez witnessing. The money would transfer within 30 days, the property would remain as free and clear, and Preston Carver would finally close a chapter his grandfather had opened 50 years earlier. After Sarah left, Daniel sat with Leo in the office that had become their temporary home, both of them quiet as they processed what had just happened. "We're really going to keep the money?" Leo asked. "We really are. What are we going to do with it?" Daniel had thought about this through months of waiting, had made plans that honored both his needs and Harrison's request to build something rather than simply consume. "First, we're going to fix this building properly. Make it safe, restore what matters, turn it into something that serves a purpose beyond just being where we live." "Like what?" "Community workshop space. Training center for trades, metalworking, welding, construction skills that people need but can't afford to learn. We'll restore the forges, bring in equipment, create apprenticeship programs that teach young people the kind of skills Harrison spent his life mastering." Leo nodded, understanding that his father was choosing to honor the source of their fortune rather than just spending it. "And we'll live here?" "We'll live here and build something that matters. That's what Harrison asked for, use the money to build rather than waste. So that's what we'll do." The restoration took 2 years. Daniel hired local contractors, used Harrison's money to employ people from Milford who'd been struggling since the steel industry died, restored the ironworks with respect for what it had been while adapting it to serve present needs. The office building became their residence, modest but comfortable, with space for Leo to grow and for Daniel to finally stop moving from crisis to crisis. The main forge building became the training center Daniel had envisioned, equipment purchased and installed by people who knew metalworking, programs developed with input from community colleges and trade unions, apprenticeships offered to young people who needed skills that would sustain them in economies that had moved beyond their parents' industries. They named it the Harrison Carver Memorial Workshop, honoring the man whose hidden fortune had made everything possible. Preston attended the opening ceremony, his expression showing something that might have been acceptance or might have been resignation to the fact that his grandfather's money had gone to purposes Harrison would have respected even if Preston had wanted it for different reasons. "My grandfather would approve," Preston said during the ribbon cutting. "He believed in building things, in teaching skills, in creating value rather than just consuming it. This is more what he would have wanted than anything I'd planned to do with the money." The workshop thrived over the following years, training hundreds of young people in metalworking and fabrication and the traditional skills that built communities before automation moved production elsewhere. Some students went on to careers in manufacturing, others started their own businesses, all of them learned from master craftspeople who volunteered their time because they believed in preserving knowledge that was slowly being forgotten. Daniel established a scholarship fund using a portion of the settlement, providing financial assistance to single parents pursuing education or training, honoring the desperation that had led him to buy a foreclosed ironworks with his last $410. The fund helped 30 families in its first 5 years, provided the kind of support that meant the difference between giving up and persisting through hardship. Leo grew up in the restored ironworks, learned metalworking from the same apprentices his father trained, developed relationships with a community that had rallied around their family after Daniel chose proper procedure over easy money. He became someone who understood that inheritance meant more than receiving, it meant honoring the source and using resources to build rather than simply consume. On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years after buying the ironworks, Daniel stood at the window where Harrison Carver had once watched 300 men work the forges below. The space was alive again now, not with steel production but with teaching and learning and the preservation of skills Harrison had spent a lifetime mastering. The building breathed with purpose, had been reborn from abandonment into something that served community and honored history while building toward futures that recognized the past. Daniel thought about the journey that had brought him here, the eviction notice, the desperate auction bid, the vault and the FBI and the legal battles that had tested whether doing things properly mattered more than taking easy money. Harrison Carver had hidden his fortune believing someone desperate enough to need it would find it eventually, would use it better than his son would have, would build something rather than waste accumulated wealth on consumption and comfort. Daniel had proven worthy of that trust not through finding the vault but through how he'd handled the discovery, reporting it honestly, following proper procedures, fighting legal battles rather than accepting settlement that benefited the Carvers more than the person who'd actually found what Harrison had hidden. The money had changed their circumstances, but the choice to do things right had changed who Daniel and Leo were, had taught lessons about integrity and persistence that would serve them longer than the financial security Harrison's fortune provided. The ironworks would stand for generations, would continue training young people and preserving skills and serving as monument to the idea that desperation sometimes led to discoveries that transformed not just individual lives but entire communities. Harrison Carver had died believing his life's work would end with his son's failures, had hidden his fortune as final desperate attempt to protect what 3 generations had built. But the vault had survived foreclosure and abandonment to be found by someone who understood that using wealth wisely meant building things that outlasted the money itself. Daniel had bought the ironworks for $410 thinking he was getting shelter. Instead he'd found inheritance that came with obligations, to honor Harrison's intent, to build something meaningful, to teach Leo that standing for principles when standing was expensive mattered more than simply choosing easy paths that led nowhere worth going. The vault had given them financial security, but the choice to claim it properly had given them something more valuable, proof that desperate gambles sometimes rewarded people who were brave enough to try and honest enough to follow rules even when breaking them would have been simpler. The workshop hummed with activity below, students learning skills that Harrison would have recognized, masters teaching traditions that connected present to past through the eternal human need to shape metal and build things that lasted. And Daniel stood watching it all, feeling satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with knowing he'd honored trust placed in him by a man he'd never met, had used desperate discovery to build something that would serve long after the settlement money was spent and forgotten. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you found but what you built from finding it, not what you inherited but what you chose to do with inheritance that accident rather than intention had placed in your hands. The ironworks had given Harrison Carver 44 years of purpose, had given Daniel and Leo sanctuary when they needed it most, would give hundreds of students skills and opportunities and connection to traditions that deserved preservation. That was worth more than any amount of money, was the kind of wealth that couldn't be counted or claimed or divided through legal settlements. It was the wealth of knowing you'd stood for something when standing mattered, had built something when building was harder than surrendering, had honored trust through choices that proved you worthy of the gifts desperate times sometimes provided. 15 years passed like the slow work of rust becoming patina, time leaving its mark on the ironworks in ways that transformed decay into character rather than simply aging. Daniel watched Leo grow from the 7-year-old boy who'd squeezed his hand at an auction to a 22-year-old man preparing to graduate from engineering school, his acceptance letter to a graduate program in sustainable manufacturing sitting on the kitchen table of the apartment they still kept in the restored office building. The Harrison Carver Memorial Workshop had become something beyond Daniel's initial vision. What had started as a simple training center had evolved into a regional hub for metal fabrication education, drawing students from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, partnering with community colleges and trade unions and manufacturers who valued the traditional skills that automation couldn't fully replace. Over 15 years, the workshop had trained 643 students, had placed 412 in manufacturing careers, had helped 78 start their own metalworking businesses. But the numbers didn't capture what mattered most, the way the workshop had given Milford a reason to exist beyond nostalgia for industries that weren't coming back. Young people stayed or returned because the workshop provided skills that translated to employment, because the community that had been slowly dying had found renewed purpose through teaching what Harrison Carver had spent his life mastering. The town's population had stabilized for the first time in 60 years, its main street showing new businesses rather than additional closures, its school enrollment holding steady instead of declining toward inevitable consolidation. Daniel had used Harrison's fortune carefully over the years, investing most of it in trusts that funded the workshop's operations and scholarship programs, keeping enough for security but never for excess. He'd found work consulting with other communities on adaptive reuse of abandoned industrial properties, helping towns figure out what to do with closed factories and empty mills that represented both history and liability. The work paid modestly but connected him to people facing the same questions about what came after industry died, how you honored the past while building toward futures that looked nothing like what came before. The ironworks itself had become more than building, it had become a living argument that abandonment didn't have to be permanent, that purpose could be found in spaces that others had written off, that legacy was something you built through choices rather than something you simply inherited. School groups toured regularly, learning about industrial history and Harrison Carver's story and the vault that had transformed one family's desperation into community resource. The building breathed with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened here, a century of steel production, decades of abandonment, the discovery that had changed Daniel's life, the slow work of restoration and renewal. Margaret Chen had passed away 8 years earlier at 93, her final years spent helping Daniel document Harrison's life and the ironworks history, ensuring that the stories weren't lost when the people who'd lived them were gone. She'd left her own papers to the workshop's small museum, photographs and records that showed what the building had been during its productive years, what it had meant to families who'd depended on it for livelihood and identity. Harrison would be satisfied, Margaret had told Daniel during one of their last conversations. Not happy, he wasn't a man who did happiness easily, but satisfied that what he built and protected is serving the purposes he believed in. Teaching young people real skills, preserving knowledge that matters, building community rather than just extracting profit. Preston Carver had visited the workshop only once in 15 years, 5 years after the settlement, his daughter Emily in tow. She'd been 17 then, curious about the grandfather she'd never met, interested in the building her father had spent years trying to reclaim. Preston had walked through the restored forge floor with an expression that mixed regret and acceptance, seeing what Daniel had built with money Preston had believed should have been his. "This is better than what I would have done," Preston had admitted during that visit, the words seeming to cost him something. "I'd planned to liquidate everything, use the money to fund my own business ventures. It would have been gone in 5 years, wasted on things that didn't matter." He'd paused in front of Harrison's portrait, which hung in the workshop's entrance hall. "My grandfather chose well when he structured things to go to someone desperate enough to need it. You needed it, and you used it the way he asked, to build rather than consume." Emily had stayed in touch after that visit, had written to Daniel occasionally through college, had returned last month with news that surprised him. She'd been accepted to the graduate program Leo was attending, was pursuing the same degree in sustainable manufacturing, wanted to work on adaptive reuse of industrial spaces. The coincidence felt less like chance and more like the way legacies actually worked, not through direct inheritance but through influence that rippled across generations, touching people who chose to be shaped by stories they learned rather than simply accepting what they'd been given. On a cool evening in late October, 15 years and 2 weeks after buying the ironworks for $410, Daniel stood in the forge building watching the final class of the fall semester. 12 students, ages 18 to 54, learning TIG welding from a master craftsman who'd spent 30 years in aerospace manufacturing before retiring to Milford to teach. The students worked with the focused intensity of people who understood they were learning skills that would sustain them, that employment depended on mastering techniques that required precision and patience. Leo found him there, his son taller now than Daniel, carrying himself with quiet confidence that came from growing up in a community that had invested in his success. They stood together watching the welding demonstration, both of them comfortable in silence that had developed through 15 years of shared experience. Emily Carver called, Leo said finally. Asked if I wanted to collaborate on my thesis project. She's researching adaptive reuse of abandoned steel mills, thinks the workshop would make a good case study for her own work. What did you tell her? That I'd think about it. Feels strange working with Preston's daughter on a project about what you built with her grandfather's money. Daniel considered this, thinking about the complicated inheritance that had brought them here, Harrison's vault, Preston's legal challenge, the settlement that had divided fortune between desperate discovery and family claim. Harrison Carver hid that money because he didn't trust his son to use it wisely, and by extension didn't trust Preston. But he never met Emily, never knew whether the next generation would be different. Maybe her interest in this work is exactly what Harrison hoped for when he wrote that letter. You think he planned that far ahead? I think he understood that legacy isn't about controlling what happens after you're gone, it's about creating conditions where good things become possible and hoping the right people find them. Daniel paused. Emily didn't inherit her grandfather's fortune, but she inherited his belief that building things matters. That's the part of legacy that actually lasts. The scholarship fund Daniel had established had grown over 15 years, supporting 53 single parents through education and training, providing the kind of assistance that meant the difference between giving up and persisting through hardship. Some recipients had gone on to good careers, had built stable lives for their children, had broken cycles of poverty that might otherwise have continued for generations. Others had struggled despite the help, had made choices that undermined opportunity, had proven that money alone couldn't solve every problem. But enough had succeeded that the fund justified its existence, that Daniel could look at families who'd been helped and know that Harrison's fortune had served purposes beyond just his own security. The fund operated quietly, without publicity or recognition, helping people who needed help in ways that preserved dignity while providing practical support. Daniel had learned through 15 years of managing the fund and the workshop that legacy was messier than stories suggested. Some people you helped thrived, others squandered opportunity, and you couldn't always predict which would be which. But you helped anyway, trusted that creating opportunities mattered even when outcomes were uncertain, believed that standing for principles had value independent of measurable results. On a Saturday in early November, the workshop hosted its annual open house, a day when the community gathered to celebrate another year of training and placement and the slow work of building something that mattered. Former students came back to share their stories, current students demonstrated skills they'd mastered, instructors talked about traditional techniques and modern applications and why preserving knowledge mattered even in an automated age. Leo gave a speech that year, his first as someone preparing to leave for graduate school, about growing up in the workshop and what it had taught him about inheritance and choice and the difference between receiving and building. "My dad bought this building for $410 when we had nowhere else to go," Leo said, standing where Harrison Carver had once supervised 300 workers. "He found a fortune hidden in the basement, money that could have let us live comfortably without working another day. Instead, he chose to honor the man who hid that fortune, to build something that served purposes Harrison Carver would have recognized and respected." Leo paused, looking at Daniel in the crowd. "I'm leaving soon for graduate school, studying the same questions this workshop answers every day: how communities adapt when their industries die, how buildings can be reborn for new purposes, how legacy gets preserved or lost depending on choices people make. But I'll carry lessons from here that no program can teach, that desperate times sometimes lead to opportunities that change everything, that standing for principles when standing is expensive matters more than choosing comfort, that what you build means more than what you inherit." After the open house ended and people drifted away, Daniel walked alone through the building that had become his life's work, that had transformed from desperate purchase to purpose that sustained not just himself and Leo but an entire community. The forge floor held equipment that would have been familiar to Harrison Carver, techniques being taught that connected present to past through the eternal human need to shape metal and build things that lasted. He climbed to the office where Harrison's portrait still hung, where Daniel had spent his first night 15 years ago with Leo sleeping beside him and no certainty about anything beyond the fact that they had shelter. The office was comfortable now, restored and maintained, but Daniel kept Harrison's portrait and the original desk and filing cabinets, kept the space as close to how it had been when Harrison supervised operations as modern safety requirements allowed. A photograph hung beside Harrison's portrait, added 10 years ago when the workshop celebrated its 5th anniversary. It showed Daniel and Leo on the forge floor, surrounded by students and instructors, all of them looking proud and purposeful. The contrast with that first desperate night was stark. Then they'd had nothing but a building. Now they'd built something that mattered to hundreds of people and would continue mattering long after Daniel was gone. Preston Carver appeared in the doorway, surprising Daniel with his presence. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, hadn't needed to after the settlement resolved their competing claims. But Preston looked older now, his confident bearing softened by time or circumstance or the recognition that some battles weren't worth fighting. "My father died last month," Preston said without preamble. "Robert Carver, the son my grandfather didn't trust with his fortune. He was 89, lived long enough to see what you built with money he'd always believed should have been his. I'm sorry for your loss." "Don't be." My father was exactly what Harrison feared, a man who would have wasted every dollar on comfort and consumption, who measured worth through possessions rather than creation. He died bitter that his own father had hidden wealth from him, never understanding why Harrison made that choice. Preston moved to the window overlooking the forge floor. But in his final weeks, when dementia stripped away pretense, he told me stories about working here as a young man. How Harrison had tried to teach him the business, how he'd rejected those lessons because he thought he knew better, How he'd failed at everything he'd attempted because he'd never learned discipline. Why are you telling me this? Because Emily is collaborating with Leo on research about this place, and I wanted you to know I support it. My daughter is more like her great-grandfather than either my father or I ever were. She understands that building things matters, that legacy is something you create rather than something you're entitled to receive. Preston turned from a window. Harrison made the right choice hiding his fortune from my father. And the vault made the right choice revealing itself to you rather than waiting for us to reclaim it. Some inheritances go to the people who need them rather than the people who want them, and that's how it should be. After Preston left, Daniel stood alone in the office thinking about the complicated inheritance that had shaped his past 15 years. He'd found Harrison's fortune through desperate accident, had claimed it through proper procedure and legal persistence, had used it to build something that honored the source while serving present needs. But the real inheritance hadn't been money, it had been the lesson that standing for things when standing was expensive mattered, that following rules even when breaking them would be simpler, that desperate times sometimes rewarded people who were brave enough to try and honest enough to do things properly. Leo left for graduate school 3 weeks later, his truck packed with everything he owned, his acceptance of Emily Carver's collaboration offer creating a partnership that would tie their futures to the stories their families had lived. Daniel watched him drive away, feeling the bittersweet pride parents experience when children they've raised well choose paths that lead away from home. But Leo would return, Daniel knew. Maybe not to live, maybe not permanently, but he'd return because the workshop was in him now, because the lessons he'd learned here about inheritance and choice and what building actually meant would shape whatever he chose to do with education and opportunity and the advantages Daniel's desperate discovery had provided. The ironworks breathed in the November air, its restored walls holding stories that spanned a century and a half, Harrison Carver's 44 years of steel production, decades of abandonment after economic forces moved on, Daniel's discovery and the battles fought to keep what he'd found, 15 years of teaching and building and slow transformation from industrial ruin to community resource. The building would stand long after Daniel was gone, would continue serving purposes that honored both its history and its present function. Students would learn metalworking in spaces where Harrison Carver had once supervised 300 men, would master techniques that connected them to traditions that deserved preservation. The workshop would train generations of craftspeople, would help families build security through skills that sustain them, would prove that some legacies survive through choice and commitment rather than through simple inheritance. Daniel walked the property one final time that evening, the November cold sharp with the promise of winter, the sky clear enough to show stars that had looked down on this land before anyone had built ironworks or forged steel or hidden fortunes in underground vaults. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the eviction notice, the auction, the vault and the FBI and the legal battles that had tested whether doing things properly mattered more than accepting easy money. Harrison Carver had died believing his life's work would end with his son's failures, had hidden his fortune as desperate final attempt to protect what 3 generations had built. But the vault had survived foreclosure and abandonment to be found by someone who understood that using wealth wisely meant building things that outlasted the money itself, that legacy was something you created through choices rather than something you simply received through accident or blood. The ironworks had given Harrison purpose for 44 years, had given Daniel and Leo sanctuary when they needed it most, would give hundreds of students skills and opportunities in connection to traditions worth preserving. That was worth more than any amount of money, was the kind of wealth that couldn't be counted or claimed or divided through legal settlements. It was the wealth of knowing you'd stood for something when standing mattered, had built something when building was harder than surrendering, had honored trust through choices that proved you worthy of gifts desperate times sometimes provided. The building settled into night, its restored forge floor silent now but ready for tomorrow's work, its office spaces holding records of 15 years of training and placement and lives changed through education and opportunity. And Daniel stood looking at it all, feeling satisfaction that came from knowing he'd taken desperate discovery and transformed it into purpose that would outlive him, that would serve long after the settlement money was spent and forgotten. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you found but what you built from finding it, not what you inherited but what you chose to do with inheritance that accident rather than intention had placed in your hands. Harrison Carver had hidden wealth believing someone desperate enough to need it would use it wisely. Daniel had proven worthy of that trust not through finding the vault but through every choice made after discovery, reporting it honestly, fighting for it properly, using it to build rather than simply consume. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles and triumphs, witnessing the slow work of buildings being reborn and communities finding renewed purpose and families choosing to stand for principles when standing was expensive. The ironworks breathed in the darkness, alive again after decades of abandonment, serving purposes its original builders never imagined but would have recognized, the eternal human need to teach and learn and build things that lasted beyond individual lifetimes. And Daniel Cross, who'd spent $410 thinking he was buying shelter, stood looking at what 15 years of choices had built, understanding that the greatest inheritance wasn't money or property or even opportunity, it was the lesson that standing for things mattered, that doing things properly even when proper was harder had value independent of outcomes, that desperate gambles sometimes rewarded people who were brave enough to try and honest enough to follow through on promises they made to strangers who'd trusted them with legacies that outlasted death. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.